Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out a complete guide on how to play Blood DK in patch 8.2, including going over all the new stuff that's been added in the patch. I'll start out this video by covering the pros and cons of DK, then move on to how to play, spec, and gear, finally finishing up with patch 8.2's new Essence system. If you already have a good handle on the class and just want a refresher, there will be a table of contents in the video description so that you can quickly skip to the section you're looking for. So now let's get into the good stuff about Blood DK. Basically, there are only 3 or 4 good reasons to actually play a Blood DK. The first is Death Grip, and the second is Gorefiend's Grasp. While DPS DKs do have access to Death Grip, and there are some other classes that can badly approximate Gorefiend's Grasp, Blood's Death Grip cooldown is shorter than that of DPS DKs, and even a really undergeared Blood DK can be indispensable as a grip bot on certain raid fights. Mechatork is a good example. In addition to that, Blood has Death Strike, which allows DKs to provide a simply ridiculous amount of self-healing for a tank. And last, and probably least among these, Anti-Magic Shell allows DKs to totally ignore some mechanics that other tanks just aren't able to get away with. And with that, let's jump to cons. With all of that great self-healing comes some of the worst active mitigation tools in the game. While Bone Shield is designed to be active 100% of the time, it's just not very good at reducing your damage taken. Second, and more importantly, DK damage output is awful. There's basically no situation in which DKs aren't horrendous at dealing damage. They suck at AoE damage, they suck at single target damage, their supposed offensive cooldowns are all more defensive than they are offensive. It's a good class for tanks who want Death Grip and the ability to stay alive pretty consistently. That's good and important. If you ever want to deal decent amounts of damage, it's not good. So now let's quickly go over talents. Here's a one-size-fits-almost all talent setup. In the first tier, Heartbreaker is the better option for runic power generation, and is thus a much better option for Mythic Plus, since it will provide more reliable healing throughout a dungeon run. Blood Drinker is absolutely the better option for raiding, since it will deal more damage over the course of a fight, and it's worth a pretty decent chunk of healing per cast despite that inaccurate tooltip. The second and third tiers are both one-option tiers. Hemostasis and Ossuary are absolute must-haves, and the alternatives to both are unappealing to say the least. Tier 4 is almost the same thing, but Rune Tap is not a bad option for some raid encounters if you find yourself really needing another defensive cooldown. Just to skip ahead a bit here, Azeroth's Undying Gift from the new Essence system is very comparable to Rune Tap, so I wouldn't be surprised to see Rune Tap become even less used in the future. Will of the Necropolis is awesome. It's a great defensive buffer that will keep you alive right when you think you're just about to die. It saved my life countless times. In Tier 5, Grip of the Dead is again the Mythic Plus option. It's very useful for slowing packs of mobs and kiting, and that's kind of it. Wraithwalk is a helpful second mobility keybind. I know it's crazy, Blood DK has 2 mobility keybinds? I didn't even list their low mobility in the cons section, that's how sorta mobile they are. You really don't need the second mobility keybind for Mythic Plus, but you don't generally need an AoE slow for raids, so there's no reason to not just go for the extra mobility when you are raiding. The 6th tier is another set it and forget it tier. Bloodworms is really good, the other 2 options are not. The last tier actually has 2 pretty decent options. Bone Storm is a very good piece of self-healing and okay damage for Mythic Plus, and it's decent in raids if you're trying to push your pathetic Blood DK damage to its limits, which aren't very high. If you are progressing on really dangerous content, then Purgatory is just another helpful defensive layer, basically a seatbelt, that will absolutely keep you alive and prevent some unnecessary wipes. Alright, now it's time to get down to the nuts and bolts of how to play the class. Blood DK has a pretty simple and forgiving ability priority, and it feels very different from most of the other tanks. Rather than trying to keep several important skills on cooldown at all times, Blood is primarily about managing your resources, which are runes, runic power, and bone shield charges. The most important rule is that while you're actively tanking, you should maintain your bone shield charges over 5 stacks. Beyond that, playing the class is primarily just about not wasting those resources. You should never let more than 3 runes sit unspent at any given time. You should try to never cap out on runic power. You should never let Blood Boil sit with both charges unspent. Only Marrow Rend if you have fewer than 7 Bone Shield charges remaining unless Bone Shield is just about to expire. I realize this seems a bit like I'm saying, hit your abilities in whatever order makes you happy. It doesn't matter, none of this matters, we're all gonna die. That's not true. Well, it's not all true. The biggest factor in how you spend your runes will be choosing whether to Marrow Rend or Heart Strike. If you're not at 7 or more Bone Shield charges, you should Marrow Rend. Otherwise, you should probably spend those runes on Heart Strike to generate more runic power to fuel your Death Strikes. If you're maintaining Bone Shield and casting Death Strike pretty frequently, you're playing Blood DK pretty well. In terms of cooldowns, DK has a very solid defensive kit. Vampiric Blood is a nice healing and life cooldown, and it's your first line of defense among your defensive cooldowns. Icebound Fortitude is Blood's shield wall. It has some really nice utility in making you immune to stuns while it's active, but it's probably also the weakest shield wall cooldown in the game, just in terms of sheer damage reduction. As a result, it's critical that you cast it before taking a big chunk of damage that threatens to kill you. I realize that's true for everyone's shield walls, but it's extra true for DK. Dancing Rune Weapon provides a huge boost to your parry chance, and it also causes your Heart Strike to generate 5 extra runic power per cast, and your Marrow Rends to generate 3 extra stacks of Bone Shield. It's a very helpful defensive and resource cooldown, and it barely registers as an offensive cooldown. And finally, Anti-Magic Shell is a really nice piece of defensive utility against magic debuffs and damage. It's simple, you just have it active before a magic debuff would be applied to you and bam, no debuff. Haha! Now let's get on to gearing. Here's the secondary stat priority for Blood DKs. The rule of thumb for gear upgrades is pretty simple. Item level is more important than stat budget on armor. If an item is a 5 item level upgrade, it's probably worth wearing, even if the secondary stats are worse. If you want to be sure, using the Simulation Craft add-on in raidbots.com is extremely helpful, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. That will only help you nail down what maximizes your DPS, but that's okay. In general, going for the highest total item level is what will maximize your defenses in this expansion. The only exceptions to this are rings and trinkets. Trinkets are obviously very different pieces of gear that need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and because rings don't have strength or armor, you should just try to wear rings that give you as much haste and versatility on them as possible. Just be sure you're not giving up a lot of item level to do it. Haste is arguably the best stat for Blood DKs. It increases your rune regeneration rate, it reduces your global cooldown, and just generally makes the class feel significantly better to play. Versatility is also arguably the best stat for Blood DKs, as it's capable of providing more healing damage and damage reduction than Haste, at the cost of not having a noticeable effect on the rotation from a feel standpoint. In any case, neither stat is bad, and they synergize pretty well with each other. Ideally, you want both. Even though Strength is listed as the worst stat, it's really not that far behind the rest of the pack. It gives you attack power and armor, and there's nothing bad about that. Now while we're on the subject of gear, let's move on to Azerite traits. Rather than cover all of the traits Blood DKs have available, let me just go over the good ones and offer up a blanket statement that everything I didn't include isn't good. Bloody Runeblade is up first, and it's a simple runic power and haste proc. It's a nice trait. You only need 1 point, but it helps speed the rotation up in a noticeable way. Next up is Eternal Rune Weapon. The strength that this adds to Dancing Rune Weapon is helpful. It makes a very weak offensive cooldown feel a little bit stronger when you need it most, and the added duration is pretty nice. And that's it for good blood traits. Bones of the Damned adds a decent chunk of armor, but the proc rate for extra bone shield charges is very low. On the whole, this trait's really just not that far off in value from Gemhide, which is kind of a bummer. Because blood spec-specific traits aren't all that appealing, you kinda just want to shoot for damage and stat proc traits wherever you can. This holds true in the second ring as well, where there are a few decent defensive traits and some good stat traits, but Heed My Call and Gut Ripper are the best traits for dealing damage. In the inner ring, there are really only two traits that are particularly good. Gem Hide is still a decent boost to your damage reduction through armor, which is great, and Impassive Visage is a versatile, reliable trickle of self-healing. Neither of these is crucial, but they're both nice if you can get them. Now let's move on to Trinkets. First off, the Diamond Lace Refracting Prism from Opulence is the only good defense first trinket in BFA. I don't know why the rest of them are all so bad, but they are, and this one's still good. Its Absorb Shield scales with haste and versatility. Now the thing to remember when wearing defensive trinkets is that you can't kill a boss by reducing its damage, so unless you're taking something that really threatens to kill you, you probably should wear something that provides extra damage instead. If you do need defense though, this trinket rules. As for dealing extra damage, there are plenty of good trinkets available in Mythic Plus. The best trinkets from Mythic Plus are Razan's Gleaming Eye from Ataldazar and Gore-Crusted Butcher's Block from Waycrest Manor. Jess Howler from Toldagor is very popular, although I'm not a huge fan. The Alchemy trinket is also pretty decent. Now finally, let's get to essences. So let's just jump directly into breaking down the essences and pointing out what I think will be the good, the bad, and the ugly of this new system. Let's start with the very first trait you'll get from this system, Crucible of Flame. It's super basic, it deals increasing damage or healing to a single target. That's it. It's basic, but it could very reasonably wind up being the best option for dealing single target damage. It is super easy to rank up, just level up your neck and complete the quests that pop up, and you'll get your new ranks. Now on to another basic essence, World Vein Resonance. This essence basically just gives you some extra strength, and all you have to do is stay within 8 yards of a thing on the ground. That risk-reward ratio isn't great. The minor power could be pretty useful in groups with other players using it on patchwork fights, but that's about it. I'm just not a fan of the major at all. Ripple in Space is a weird delayed teleport that deals damage. I don't get it. No thank you, Mr. Blizzard. Memory of Lucid Dreams is the first, really interesting option. It grants you increased rune regeneration, and the minor is a 15% chance to return 50% of any runes you spend. Basically, the major power works like an on-demand runic corruption, which can be a pretty nice boost to your healing and damage for a brief period. If I could have any wish granted, it would be for the cooldown to be shorter. Again, like most DK cooldowns, it winds up feeling more defensive than it does offensive, so there's that as well. Overall, the major power is okay. As for the minor power, there's obviously a concern that you can't refund half a rune, so what this does is it stores up when you get half a rune refund until you get 2 half rune refunds, then gives you back a full rune. There's not really anything you can do with that information, but you know it now. Congratulations! Runes are obviously very valuable to Blood DK, and just on paper the minor is worth 7.5% more of them. That's interesting, but I'm not sure if it's good or reliable enough to compete with a lot of the other minor powers that are available. Next up is Vision of Perfection, which is straight up terrible for Blood DKs. It grants you a 3.5 second proc of Vampiric Blood. What are you supposed to do with that? Take another power, that's what. Conflict and Strife is the last of the role-agnostic Azerite Essences, and it comes from rated PvP. For Blood DK, it grants Unholy Command, which has the potential to be an incredible boost to utility for fights in which you need to do a lot of gripping. Outside of those grip bot scenarios, this power would be pretty useless. Now on to the tank-specific essences. Azeroth's Undying Gift is a very simple defensive cooldown. It comes from the new Eternal Palace raid. This power is basic, but pretty decent. If you find yourself needing another defensive cooldown for raid, this is the best option offered by Essence powers. Anima of Life and Death is another very interesting option for Blood DKs, and it looks to be the best choice for dealing AoE damage. It's a pretty long cooldown for an AoE damage skill, but the healing and max health it provides are nice. I like this power, and I think given the lack of competition Blood DK has from other traits, I would expect this to see a lot of use, particularly in Mythic Plus and even on ad fights and raid. This can be combined with Vampiric Blood to buff its damage and healing even further. Next up is Aegis of the Deep, which is not a good essence. It was buffed right at the end of the PTR, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more buffs in the future, but unless it's completely redesigned, it's not going to be good. Flat damage reduction just isn't a good design. You really need to be taking a lot of small hits, or tanking something that's just very easy for this to have much impact. Currently, it only stands to be a 10 to 20% damage reduction cooldown for blood decays under normal circumstances. And it's on the global cooldown. It's just not good. The minor power, on the other hand, provides a sizable chunk of versatility when tanking large groups of adds, so it's probably going to be very good for Mythic Plus. Nullification Dynamo has a decent minor power. It's not crazy, but it's very good if you need magic damage mitigation. The major power, on the other hand, is Undertune. The cooldown is super long, and it's on the global cooldown. All of that's way too much. It's the worst. And last but not least among the tank essences, it's Sphere of Suppression. The minor power grants a reactive slow and a small boost to haste and movement speed. It's not a huge deal, but it's fine. The major power's 25% attack speed slow could be a very decent defensive cooldown in Mythic Plus. And while it could be useful as a kiting tool, Blood already has a 90% AoE slow in Death and Decay. As a result, I'm really not sure this will get a ton of use for Blood DKs. So just to recap, Crucible of Flame looks like the best single target damage power, and Anima of Life and Death is definitely going to be the best AoE damage power. Defensively, Azeroth's Undying Gift looks very good for raids. Everything else doesn't really look all that great. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Blood DK, ask away. With Ashara's Eternal Palace and Mythic Dungeon Season 3 coming soon, we have some cool ideas for videos to do, but if there's anything you'd like to see, we'd love to know. Stay tuned for more Patch 8.2 content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.